Hi everybody, this is Francisco Gil-White for Arutz and Management of Reality in our joint programming. Just a quick heads up reminder. You can turn on subtitles in your preferred language, Hebrew, Spanish, or English by clicking the CC button on your phone at the top or on your computer down below. Today I have the pleasure of welcoming Chaim Ben Pesach from the Jewish Task Force, JTF, to my show. We're going to be talking about different organizations that claim to be pro-Israel, but their behavior doesn't seem to be that pro-Israel. So I want to ask Chaim Ben Pesach about this because he has a long career as a defender of Jews. And I'd like to understand, Chaim Ben Pesach, what, for example, happens at AIPAC. Because AIPAC claims that AIPAC is the boogeyman of all of the anti-Semites who claim that there is a gigantic Jewish conspiracy that strangles the world and controls U.S. foreign policy for the benefit of Israel and so on and so forth. AIPAC is supposed to be the center of all of that, according to these guys. But as far as I can tell, the Oslo process, which has been the most important U.S. policy towards Israel in the last half century, is an attack on Israel because the Oslo process was the diplomatic vehicle for bringing PLO Fatah, which is descended from the German Nazi final solution and is the creator of jihadi Iran, into militarily strategic territory of Israel. So it seems to be that anybody supporting the Oslo process can't possibly be a friend of Israel. AIPAC is supposed to be the organization that is lobbying the U.S. government to produce pro-Israel foreign policy. So how is it that AIPAC has always been in favor of the Oslo process? I think it's almost like a principle, a sacred principle of AIPAC.
First of all, it's an honor and a privilege to be speaking to you because I know that you made a big sacrifice in your career because of your principles and because of your desire to show your support for Israel and the Jewish people. And it's really an honor and a privilege to speak to you. That's number one. I had to say that. As far as AIPAC is concerned, the leaders of AIPAC are left-wing Jews who supported Barack Hussein Obama, who supported left-wing Democrats. The Democrat Party is completely anti-Israel now, completely against Israel. All of them support a so-called Palestinian state, which would be suicide for Israel. All of them condemn and criticize what Israel does in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Iran. It is a very anti-Israel party. AIPAC supports the Democrat Party. AIPAC gave in 2024 millions of dollars. AIPAC-affiliated organizations contributed millions of dollars to 214 Democrats running for Congress. Every single one of them supports a Palestinian state. Not one of them is a friend of Israel. And AIPAC gives them millions of dollars. That's AIPAC, an organization which does the opposite of what's in the interests of Israel and the Jews. By the way, if people want to check AIPAC's positions on the issues, go to the AIPAC website. On their front page, they speak about how they support what they call the two-state solution. They support creating a Palestinian terrorist state. And let's understand what that means. That means Israel will be in borders that are 6 to 9 miles wide. That means that the Muslim terrorists who want to exterminate Israel will be one mile or 1 kilometer from Natbag, from the Israeli airport. That means that all of Israel will be within the range of artillery fire and gunfire and everything else that the Muslims want to do to destroy Israel. It will be 1,000 times worse than what we saw on October 7th if Israel allows the creation of a Palestinian terrorist state. It would be absolute insanity, and that is what AIPAC advocates. Today, it is no longer controversial in America. Should there be a Palestinian state or should there not be a Palestinian state? Today, there's a consensus that there should be a Palestinian state. Why is there a consensus? Because AIPAC, which supposedly represents the pro-Israel view, supports creating a Palestinian state. So they've created a situation where there's a consensus that we should go for this suicidal step of creating a Palestinian state in Israel's biblical heartland, again, which would render Israel in borders that are only 6 to 9 miles wide. This is what AIPAC is advocating. And so in American politics, it's a given that there has to be a Palestinian state, and that you now can be pro-Israel if you support a Palestinian state. By the way, Golda Meir, who was from the left-wing Labor Party, said that any Jew who supports this is a traitor. That's what she said. Boged, she said in Hebrew, which is traitor. Abba Eban, who was very left-wing on the left of the Labor Party, said that the border lines of the 1967 war, which is what would be created with a Palestinian state, are Auschwitz lines, suicide lines. This is what AIPAC supports. This is the so-called pro-Israel lobby. It's unbelievable. And Netanyahu, the prime minister, he has the power to stop this. He's not stopping it. He allows AIPAC to continue to do this. So in my opinion, he's also guilty.
Okay, so it seems that the impression that so many people have about AIPAC is exactly upside down, because as you said, people call AIPAC the center of the pro-Israel lobby, but in fact, it appears that the proper description of AIPAC in functional terms is that AIPAC is there to legitimize policies that are in fact anti-Israel. So once you package the anti-Israel policy in a way that AIPAC can sell it, then it'll sound to people like that can't possibly be anti-Israel because AIPAC is selling it. So that's the function of AIPAC, to make something kosher. That is in fact anti-Israel. Would that make sense to you?
Absolutely. That's exactly what's going on here. The
but
Jewish
wouldn't
left,
that mean? Wouldn't that mean that the so-called pro-Israel lobbying environment is in fact controlled by the enemies of Israel?
in my opinion, that is what it means. The only thing AIPAC does, they lobby for U.S. foreign aid to Israel, which I think is bad for Israel. That's a whole nother discussion, but I think that U.S. foreign aid to Israel hurts Israel.
Well, that's a very interesting, statement. Tell us why.
Because Israel receives $3.8 billion in so-called foreign aid, they're compelled to spend the money on U.S. weapon systems. They're not allowed to develop their own weapon systems in most cases. The United States has the power to veto Israeli deals with other countries. Israel loses tens of billions of dollars in trade deals and in arms sales to countries like India and dozens of other countries that want to purchase Israeli weapons and want to do trade with Israel. The United States vetoes those agreements. And this makes Israel vulnerable to U.S. pressure. U.S. pressure to commit suicide, to accept a Palestinian state, which is suicidal. That's what foreign aid does. Israel would be better off without it. Netanyahu himself said in 1996, when he spoke before the Congress, that Israel was going to do away with the foreign aid. But he never kept that promise, and we're still stuck with it, and it's hurting Israel. It doesn't help Israel.
Okay, so it sounds like what is usually called foreign aid for Israel, which has become another boogeyman for people who never sound like friends of Israel. They're always complaining that the U.S. is giving too much to Israel, blah, blah, blah. But it sounds like what people call foreign aid to Israel is really corporate welfare for the U.S. defense companies. And because it's money that is quote unquote given to Israel, but which Israel is obligated to spend on U.S. military hardware, and that in turn means that those particular defense industries will not be developed in Israel, so it creates the dependency you're talking about, which in turn gives the U.S. bosses control over Israeli foreign policy, because they can close the spigot of the weapons that Israel needs at any time they want, which is of course what Joe Biden did not too long ago. So this should not be called foreign aid, it seems to me. It should be called the leash, the U.S. leash on Israel.
Absolutely. Absolutely, 100%. That is exactly what's happening. And it's because the leaders of Israel have decided that Israel should be a puppet state of the United States. There's no reason for that. Israel can be independent. Israel can produce her own weapon systems. Israel is fully capable.
Would it be fair to say, in your opinion, that the enormous control that the U.S. bosses have achieved over Israeli foreign policy through these means have been employed to hurt Israel?
Oh, there's no question about it that the United States has repeatedly pressured Israel to do things that are against her interests.
Can you give us a few examples?
Certainly. Well, in 1948, the United States was against the creation of the State of Israel. They told David Ben-Gurion not to declare a Jewish state. And they imposed an arms embargo on Israel when Israel did declare a Jewish state. In 1967, they threatened Israel not to defend herself in that war. And President Johnson imposed an arms embargo on Israel in 1967. Then afterwards, when Israel did become dependent on the United States, artificially dependent, because Israel is capable of becoming independent. But when Israel did become dependent, repeatedly the United States has threatened to cut off foreign aid and has threatened to cut off arms shipments to Israel if Israel does not do what the United States demands. Donald Trump, by the way, openly says, I'm the boss. Netanyahu knows I'm the boss. He knows that he has to do what I say. Trump openly says this. I mean, this is Israel is completely losing her sovereignty, and we see the consequences of this. That Israel is unable to win in Gaza, unable to win against Hezbollah in Lebanon, unable to take care of the threat, the Syrian, Turkish.
May I qualify that, Chaim? May I qualify that, because it seems to me that Israel is not really unable to win. What I see happening is that in every single front, Donald Trump has required Netanyahu to throw away his military victory, which is not the same thing as being unable to win. Would you agree with that characterization?
Yes, I think you described it better than I did. I agree.
Okay, so my question to you would then be the following. Would it make sense to say that the U.S. is an ally of Israel?
We don't have real friends or allies in foreign policy. In foreign policy, nations don't have friends. Nations only have interests. If it's in United States interest to support Israel, the United States will support Israel. When it's not in United States interest, the United States will not support Israel.
You're avoiding the question, Chaim. So let me just make clear what I'm asking, because I agree with you that countries are going to do what's in their interest, and if the people running the United States, the U.S. bosses, decide that it is in their interest to do X or Y, that's what they're going to do. I think that's an axiom. We don't need to belabor that. But my question is going to the heart of what those interests are. So if the U.S., for example, sees a common interest with Britain, then they become allies of Britain. And I think we would all agree that there has been a special relationship and a strong alliance between the ruling elites of the United States and Britain. So my question is are the U.S. bosses real allies of Israel, or do they just pretend to be real allies of Israel and then undermine Israeli security in a consistent manner over the decades? That's the question.
I think they do undermine Israeli security, and so I don't think that they're genuine allies of Israel. By the way, I think you correctly refer to them as the rulers of the United States. I forgot the exact term you're using, but it's you are very correct.
The bosses.
The bosses. You're very correctly identifying what goes on, because there is a ruling elite in the United States and in Western countries.
Yeah.
I believe that what they're doing is also not in the best interest of the United States, but that's a whole different discussion. But they have a plan to appease the Muslim world and to do it at the expense of Israel.
Okay, so here's a historical question. I'd like to know if you're aware of historian Christopher Simpson's research on the creation of the CIA.
No, I'm not.
Okay, because I think it might be relevant to this discussion, because what Christopher Simpson documented, and he published his book Blowback, which I recommend that you read, in 1988. It's called Blowback, The Recruitment of Nazis, the American Recruitment of Nazis and Its Effects on the Cold War, I believe the subtitle is. And in that book, Christopher Simpson, thanks to an enormous amount of material that he was able to get from the U.S. government, thanks to the Freedom of Information Act, he was able to document that immediately after World War II, in 1947, with the passage of the National Security Act, which created the CIA, among other intelligence agencies, the U.S. government, what they did was they basically absorbed Fremde Heer Ost, which was Adolf Hitler's intelligence infrastructure in Eastern Europe. And that's what became the CIA. And we're talking about at least tens of thousands of Nazi and Nazi collaborators, which were simply absorbed to create the U.S. clandestine service after the war. Do you think that might help us explain the shape and intention of U.S. foreign policy in the post-war?
To a degree. I think that even more, if we want to go even further than that, multinational corporate billionaires behind the scenes control U.S. foreign policy because they own the news media. They are the ones that contribute most of the money to the political candidates in both parties. They're the ones with massive influence because of the multinational corporations that they run. They control U.S. foreign policy, and they control the foreign policy of every Western country.
But Chaim, come on. People say that the Jews control the media. What do you say to that?
Well, of course, it's absurd. There's no question that there are Jews who have a disproportionate influence in the media. That's true. They do have disproportionate influence. The problem is that the Jews who are in the media are all anti-Israel, are all self-hating Jews. The Jews
So in other words,
in the media.
So in other words,
I wish there weren't Jews in the media. They're enemies of Israel. All of them bend over backwards to show, I'm an American, I'm not loyal to Israel. They're the worst problem for Israel. I wish we didn't have Jews in the media.
So it sounds like you're saying that the Jews in the media are similar to, in other words, play a functional role that is analogous or homologous to AIPAC, right? Because as we were saying, AIPAC seems to have the role of putting a kosher seal on U.S. policies that are in fact anti-Israel. Now it sounds like we're describing a media system where the people in power at the top of the media system, those people are anti-Israel, so they hire Jews who are also anti-Israel, so that it'll seem like that kind of narrative cannot possibly be anti-Israel if it's being spewed by Jews.
Exactly. That's exactly what happens. And it's because the assimilated Jews that are in positions of power in the United States, they desperately want to end what they consider to be the reason for anti-Semitism. They believe the reason for anti-Semitism is because we have a Jewish state and because we're Jews and we have a separate people, and we've got to end all of that. We've got to appease all of our enemies. And we've got to even agree with our enemies, and hopefully that will solve the problem.
Okay, so these people, how do they explain anti-Semitism before there was a Jewish state? Because before there was a Jewish state, there was so much anti-Semitism in the West that between 5 and 6 million Jews were exterminated in Europe during World War II. But there was no Jewish state then. So how do they explain anti-Semitism before the Jewish state?
All of them have their own explanations for what caused anti-Semitism. They generally believe that assimilationist policies are the best remedy for this, and they're willing to give up their Jewish identity completely in order to do this. I mean, many of them are against the very existence of Israel, and so we could go into a history of the New York Times Jews. For instance, the New York Times, the most incredibly powerful media source. Which during the Holocaust defended Hitler before the Holocaust defended Hitler in the 1930s, called him Herr Hitler, and you look at the articles there where they were saying Hitler is not a dictator. He's not like Mussolini because there are still other parties in the Reichstag. He's not a dictator. Defending Hitler. This was the New York Times, and then in the 1940s, doing everything they could to prevent any action on the Holocaust, and then opposing the creation of a Jewish state after the Holocaust. Those are the Jews with power. That's what Jews with power have done in the United States.
Okay,
and so
I'm sorry, we're running out of time, but this was a very interesting conversation. I hope we can have another one. Thank you for your time, and we'll come back to these topics because they're very important.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Everybody, this is Francisco Gil-Whyte for Arutz Tov and Management of Reality in our joint programming. Please subscribe, give us a like, share, and ding that bell. And if you want more content, you'll find the links in the description. See you soon.
יש אירועים שפשוט אי אפשר לחוות דרך המסך.
אני עודד ניר. במשך כמעט 20 שנה חייתי ופעלתי באירופה ועקבתי מקרוב אחרי מה שקורה ליהודים במערב. מה שראיתי שם, ובעיקר מאז 7 לאוקטובר, שינה את כל מה שאני חשבתי שאני יודע. בחמישי והשישי בנובמבר, בנופש של ערוץ טוב במלון נבל דוד בנתניה, נבחן באמת מה קורה ליהודים באירופה, בקנדה, בארצות הברית ובאוסטרליה, ומה המשמעות של כל זה עבור עתיד הקהילות היהודיות בעולם. לצד ההרצאה שלי מחכים לכם יומיים של תוכן איכותי, הרצאות ברמה גבוהה, אנשים נפלאים ואירוח מפנק, מלון 5 כוכבים, על בסיס פנסיון מלא.
מחיר מיוחד לחברי מועדון היחידה. מספר המקומות מוגבל.